Are you okay with going ahead?
Yes, that's no problem. Let me just turn my camera on.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks for having me. This has actually been super interesting for me to hear too, because I don't really overlap very much with any of the speakers so far. So it's been really interesting. My name is Alicia Wasula. I own Tree Meteorology. So I am a meteorologist. I work in what can be probably described as a pretty small niche area known as forensic meteorology. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what that is as we're going through here, and a little bit about how I got to where I am, which is kind of a non-traditional path as well. I know it's been talked about by previous speakers. So what does a forensic meteorologist do? Well, the majority of what we do involves research and report writing for legal purposes. So like if there's a lawsuit, which could be, any type of lawsuit, but a lot of personal injury, property claims, those kinds of things where the weather played a role. The attorneys will get involved in their case and realize that they may not know everything that they need to know about how to interpret the weather record. And it's interesting in meteorology because the weather data is actually free and it's archived by the government. So anybody can go in and get the weather data that they need for a specific case, but then interpreting it and really doing a full analysis of what happened, looking at radar to see if there's precipitation going on, and those kinds of things are where we would get brought on. So this is a really interesting area of meteorology. It's outside of forecasting. I don't do anything with forecasting. So that's one reason that I ended up here. I actually got into meteorology because I was always interested in the weather, which is kind of the story of a lot of us who work in this field. I always like science. I really like the weather. And I figured out pretty early on that I wasn't very good at forecasting. I didn't really enjoy it, although I love the science of it and looking back at past weather events and learning what happened. So that's where my real skill was and what I really enjoy doing today about my job. I also realized that if you're going to work for the government, you need to be able to work shifts. And that's part of a lot of different meteorology jobs, especially if you're doing forecasting. The weather goes on 24/7, and so media meteorologists who work for TV stations, government meteorologists who work for the Weather Service, they'll also be working rotating shifts or at least some kind of shift work, and that's very difficult. And if you know you're going to be doing that early on and it doesn't bother you, then that's great. But a lot of people get into those kinds of jobs and kind of realize that it's a lot harder. So I was really fortunate to do an internship, actually a lot of internships. I interned with a local forensic meteorologist who's doing, he was at the time, doing what I do today. So that was neat. I also had an internship with the local office of the National Weather Service. So I got to see that government branch of meteorology. And so basically I always tell students that if there are any internship opportunities that arise, even if it's something you don't know if you really want to do, I would take them. A lot of the connections that I made through my student internships as an undergraduate really led me to the path that I am today. I mentioned that I had an internship with a local forensic meteorologist. At the time I did the internship, I really didn't think I wanted to do this kind of work, but coming back to it, I actually really, really love it. So it's kind of a neat full circle experience. When I was at the National Weather Service, I met the former owner of this company. He, at the time, was a government meteorologist. He retired and started the company that was Shade Tree Meteorology back in 2004. So I have kind of, like I said, a non-traditional career path. I had a family fairly young. I was in graduate school when I had my daughter. And so I spent about 5 years when my kids were young doing a lot of teaching. So I did adjunct teaching pretty much anywhere I could. I taught upper level classes in meteorology. I taught gen ed classes. Up until last spring, I actually had continued to teach through today. I really enjoy engaging with students, and I actually found that community colleges were a neat place to meet a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, and they would come and take the weather class because they thought it sounded cool. So I really enjoyed that. And then as my kids got bigger, I started looking for some different types of work. and I reconnected with the owner of this company who was kind of looking for some help at the time. And that's how I ended up here. I worked with him for about 3 years, and then as he retired, I was actually able to purchase the business from him. And today, you can see the picture up there. I have one employee of my own. She's actually remote in Alabama. I'm based in upstate New York, so I'm actually not even in the same state as you guys today. But there's meteorologists who do what I do all over the country. And a lot of us do have our own businesses. So having the opportunity to have a business and own it has been something that I never thought that I would do. And I really, really, really am so glad to have had the opportunity, and I love it. It gives me a lot of flexibility. It's a lot of hard work, but it's definitely a lot of fun too. So you want to go to the next slide? So I mentioned that we a lot of times work for attorneys. We're retained by the attorneys, although the people or the entities in the lawsuits could be anything from insurance companies to single, individuals. It really could be anything. And what's interesting about this work is that it tends to be kind of geographical. So it's okay. You can even go to the next one. So I work in the Northeast United States, but I take cases from all over the country. And you can see on the left there is a little pie chart that shows different types of legal cases. On the right is a pie chart that shows different types of weather. So what's interesting is that the vast majority of the cases that we take, even though I have a colleague in Alabama, are slip and falls on ice. And that's just because the history of this company is that it was started in the Northeast. And so lawyers like people who are local in case you have to travel to a trial and those kinds of things. So you tend to get a lot of regional expertise. And the number of slip and fall cases we deal with vastly outnumbers everything else. But we do take all different types of cases. So I have a case right now, two actually, that are dealing with flooding. There's usually municipalities involved, those kinds of things. It might be motor vehicle accidents. We've had some of those cases recently as well. So even though it's heavily weighted towards one type of weather event, every single case is different. So we find that even cases for the same storm, the weather might have unraveled a little bit differently depending on where the incident happened, if it was in Boston or if it was in New York City, and the laws are different everywhere. So communication is super important in this field. You have to be able to take your science, which has to be super, sound, and you have to use good practices, because if you go to court, you have to say that you use the right practices and methods. But you have to be able to explain it. So my teaching background actually has helped with that. So it's really a neat application of taking science and explaining it to people who are not scientists. So that could be lawyers, it could be a jury, you never know. So I really enjoy doing that. And I think that's something that maybe I didn't realize when I was doing the internship back then. I thought, that it was a lot of science, and I didn't actually learn about the application part and taking it to people who are not scientists until a little bit later on. But it's actually one of the things I really love about what I do. You can go to the next slide. So day-to-day duties, this is hilarious because I look at this list and it may be all of these, it may be none of these. One of the things about being a business owner is that no day is typical. And I'm sure this is true if you work in other private industry where it's a bigger company or even in the government, but particularly for entrepreneurs, you have to be willing to kind of be flexible, and you have to be pretty organized in terms of knowing what needs to get done and triaging sort of the really big important deadlines. Right now, I'm juggling about 2 or 3 very large size projects that we need to do research for. They're all going to have deadlines in the spring. And then a bunch of smaller projects that don't really have deadlines, but they kind of do because lawyers don't have a deadline until they actually have a deadline, and then it's tomorrow. So that can be a little bit challenging. One of the things we also like to do are talks like this, talking to schools. I miss going in person. That was really one of my favorite things, was to talk to students of all ages, because, this little area of meteorology is something that I didn't know existed. And there's probably a lot of other jobs like that where, you don't know that they exist unless you actually meet somebody who's doing that job. So getting out and talking about what we do is really one of our favorite things. Both myself and my employee really enjoy that part of the work. Being a business owner, there's also administrative tasks. I have a bookkeeper, but I have to work with her on things. I have to do scheduling. I have to plan workload for myself and my employee. There's just a lot of different things that have to be done, and it's a really neat place to be. Like I mentioned, owning your own business is something that's very, it's really empowering. You feel like you're in charge, but then sometimes you can get really bogged down in the day-to-day things that have to get done too. So there's kind of a balance there. I've always worked at home with this job, which is another thing that has really worked well for my family. I have 2 kids who are 15 and 12. And even as they've gotten older, I've really enjoyed that. But it's definitely something where you would want to learn to set boundaries too. Like I have to close the door to my office and I don't go on my computer unless I need to on the weekends. It's really, I'm sure everybody's learned this now because we're all sort of working at home in some capacity. And so, you have to just be able to set those boundaries. Otherwise, you're just on all the time, and that can be very draining. And I've gotten into that pattern. So that's kind of something that I've learned. So I think that's pretty much all I have about what I do, but I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Are there any questions in the chat? Or if anyone has any questions, they can speak up. But yes, that was very interesting. I did not know that this was a sector in meteorology, so it's super cool to learn about.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And if there's any follow-up questions or you think of something afterwards, feel free to reach out too.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for helping out and participating.
Absolutely. Glad to do it. Nice to meet you all.
Yes. All right, so next